Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Broninsky, and today I'm talking to Vera Trappmann, Professor of Comparative Employment Relations at Leeds University, about the role of trade unions within climate policymaking. Professor Trappmann's work has documented the historical and contemporary views of union leaders and members, as well as the official policies and agendas of their organisations, particularly in the UK and Germany. Much of her recent research has studied the extent to which union perspectives do or don't overlap with academic criticisms of economic growth as a barrier to effective climate mitigation.
We see a big difference between the global north and the global south here. So a lot of the very transformative demands are coming from trade unions in the global south. And that probably is also linked to how unions understand justice in this process.
There is a common perception, especially within the more technocratic spheres of the climate sector, that the union movement can be a barrier to decarbonisation efforts, both through the support of continued investment in fossil fuels and for increased investment in other heavy industries. Vera's own research adds a lot of nuance to such issues, so it's hard to make accurate generalisations, but I asked her to begin by addressing this idea, whether there's any truth in it, and why people might hold this view.
I think in general there is this perception that there is a kind of dilemma between environmental protection and jobs, and for long there was the perception that those can't go together. So the idea was the more environmental protection we have, the more we address climate change and invest in climate mitigation, it would impact jobs and workers negatively. And this perception continued quite a while, and maybe it's a reason why trade unions have been not engaging as much in climate policies as they are doing now, or as they should have done much earlier. But the picture has changed quite a lot in the last 15 years. And for the UK more recently, there are actually quite positive initiatives where we can see that trade unions have changed their views, even thinking that not only that it's absolutely necessary to address climate change, but that there are also a lot of opportunities for workers, not as citizens affected by climate change, but also as workers.
I saw in some of your research you also addressed that there's been a bit of a division within academia, at least until the early 2010s, between researchers looking at environmental and climate policy and those looking at labour issues.
Yes, it's true that for long the disciplines weren't talking much to each other. And while, despite we all know about the advantages of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, it still happened that sociologists looked at the environment but didn't look at the future of work and the environment. And I've been thinking about this a lot, why it comes that in my field, employment relations, nature has been absent for so long, which is really astonishing if you think that one of the founding figures, Karl Marx, looked at exploitation of workers, of labor, and at exploitation of land. But somehow this has been neglected in the analysis by employment relations scholars, and it's only recently that it starts to come back, mostly then in empirical studies trying to understand how environmental destruction is affecting the labor process. But I think we still have to write the nature back into the theory of the 21st century. And in other disciplines where there's much more research around nature itself, the aspect of labor and workers and how it affects employment has been completely absent. So I'm really pleased that now there is a kind of dialogue and it's more vice versa, cross-fertilizing the research, and more collaborations across the disciplines have been emerged.
I thought before we move on to contemporary issues and dynamics, maybe we could look at some of your studies around the history of union engagement with climate policy and environmental policy. One of the really interesting things that I learned from your writing is that you frame the just transition as a concept as emerging from the labour movement much earlier than I'd realised in the 1960s or 70s. And you reference in several of your papers the American unionist Tony Mazzocchi as perhaps the founder of this idea.
Yes, that's really interesting because it wasn't related to climate change, but it was related to pollution. And it was the attempt to protect workers from polluting industries. So it was more a health and safety aspect. And the concept then has found its way into international climate, mainly through the International Labour Organization. So they formulated guidelines of a just transition. So they extended the concepts and said, basically linked it to decarbonisation. So if we decarbonize our economies, it has to happen in a way that is not negatively affecting workers. And that was then not only in terms of health and safety and job loss, but they said any kind of just transition that can call itself just has to provide for social dialogue, has to offer the right to collective bargaining, and has to offer coherent policies across different policy fields, including gender equality, the creation of decent jobs, and the protection in case of job loss. So in these criteria that the ILO has formulated in 2015, kind of a measure, if you look at what governments are doing when they decarbonize and to what extent are workers included. And when you look across the globe, we can find narrow interpretations of what that means, where basically mainly workers who work in fossil fuels are protected from job loss. And this is what in the literature we call affirmative policies, to very transformative policies where the scale or the scope and even the depth of the transition is very far-reaching, so that it's not just the energy workers or not just one region, but where a different economic model is proposed and where unions demand abandoning extractivism or abandoning exploitative economic models, and to the degree that they ask for renationalization of the energy sector. Interestingly, we see a big difference between the global north and the global south here. So a lot of the very transformative demands are coming from trade unions in the global south. And that probably is also linked to how unions understand justice in this process. So is justice mainly the protection of members' interests, which then often is the protection of employment in the global north? Or does it include historical injustices, dependencies of global south countries, dependency on extractivism for products that are then produced in the global north? Our colleagues in South Africa look at just transition and they consider that it is a very exploitative neo-colonial project. So they're not really in favor. And this is linked to the fact that a lot of the funding that they are supposed to receive to support them with their just transition is coming from Western nations. And they then want to decide how the money has to be spent. There wasn't enough participation from worker unions to determine the path of the transition and the energy transition in those countries. It's also a question of pace in a country like South Africa, where you have energy poverty. How quickly can you transition and phase out from coal? The questions seem different. How can you give access to energy and electricity to more people? Then it becomes broader systemic questions than just decarbonizing one sector. It's fascinating. It's really a political debate.
So in your writing, you said that the kind of union advocacy of the idea of a just transition did follow through to influencing the UNFCCC and broader international climate policy development. Are there points of agreement between different nations, union, confederations on some of those issues that you're just talking about, or is agreement emerging on any of those areas?
Yeah, the agreement is definitely there in terms of that the climate crisis is urgent and that it needs climate action and that it shouldn't be at the expense of workers. And there are a lot of international agreements. And in the ILO, for example, is a tripartite organization. So you have the representation of trade unions there. You have the international federations who come up with joint proposals. Then you had at COP, you had a just transition back in Silesia in 2018, where unions did agree on the kind of basic demands and claims, that it's not at the expense of workers, and that any transition should follow the ILO guidelines. In our research, I was leading a project that looked at just transition in 14 countries. And we had events where we invited trade unionists from several countries and had some kind of dialogue going on. And it was so good to see firsthand that the problems are very similar for workers and their representatives, even if the socio-political context is quite different. But what was also clear is that questions of international solidarity between workers, especially with the current geopolitical difficulties and with a kind of withdrawal from globalization and the protectionism of national economies, there is a much bigger need for international solidarity of workers and to see, so it's not the other workers that we are in competition with, it's with global capital. And this dialogue needs to continue to be held between trade unions in different countries.
Perhaps if we start with Germany in the 90s, how that engagement with the idea of the just transition developed into more concrete climate agendas.
I think something interesting as a background for Germany is that we have a long tradition of a strong Green Party. It's been around for a long time, and although most decades it was in opposition, but it was a voice that was heard in opposition, and we had national governments where the Green Party was in a coalition of power. We have federal states where the Green Party is in power. So there is a kind of political context where, let's say, green ideas are more prevalent in the German society. So there is a different ground for ideas and also a different pressure to take up those ideas. While maybe traditionally trade unions have been closer to the Labour Party, there has been an opening up to speak to other parties as well. And there was a phase in the initial 90s where the German Trade Union Association has been quite radical and asking for a sustainable economy, putting really into question the idea of growth. But that was a very short period in time. Since then, there is a strong continuity that the trade unions ask for ecological modernization. They really emphasize the role of the state. Colleagues and I, we call it a state-driven ecological modernization, what the German movement is asking for. And that demands a strong regulation from the side of the state. And in a way that, on the one hand, asks for a framework that gives workers a lot of rights to be involved in any kind of climate policy and transformation. And it asks for interventionist funding. That speaks very well to the German model of employment relations. So you have co-determination, you have the fundamental right to have representatives in supervisory boards of companies. Depending on the size of the company, you can have up to 50% of workers represented in the boards, then bringing in the interests of the workers to the decision-making. You have the right to elect a works council at the shop floor level. So there has always been a really strong emphasis on dialogue and social partnership. And often workers have become almost like the co-managers. So we have a kind of crisis-proven model where workers are involved, and sometimes in multinational companies where managers move from one location or subsidiary to the next, it's the works councils who are the ones who pertain a policy that is like protecting sites, locations, and the workers. And this strong tradition is something that the workers and trade unions are picking up now when it comes to decarbonizing and all the change that is resulting from decarbonizing, as well as the other big change ahead, digitalization.
Could you just elaborate briefly what you mean by ecological modernization? What set of policies that might refer to?
It has a strong emphasis on technological fixes. So there is the idea that technological innovation, you can address climate change and global warming. And it's a kind of idea of green growth where you produce the products differently, maybe you produce different products as well, but it's not a fundamental shift in terms of the economic model. But there is an interesting overlap with the worldviews of a group of people where you would never expect that there is an overlap. So we did look at fierce critics of the economic model, degrowth and post-growth movements, and wanted to understand, so how do they see the future of work and how do trade unions see the future of work? And interestingly, there is a huge overlap in the worldviews of those two groups when it comes to ideas around what means justice, around redistribution, around participation, about what means quality of life in their aims to reduce social inequality, in the aim to democratize the economy, to expand public infrastructure and to taxing the rich. Also, the German unions have a concept of not of degrowth or post-growth, but of qualitative growth. So they would like to see a growth only in sectors that do not do any harm and that provide immense or good life. And I think that is important to not perceive, and we know it from the latest reports, that growth is put into question, that it's probably not to be combined with environmental protection. And this is now the moment in time to understand what kind of post-growth, qualitative growth could we have. And when we spoke in our research, when we spoke to trade unions in Germany, it was really interesting to see. So despite the kind of motions that are put forward that are in the area of green growth and technological fixes, but also in complete support to renewable energy. So the German movement wants to see the shift to renewable energy as soon as possible. But at the fringes, you do see really critical voices who would think that maybe we don't need growth. Maybe we can have jobs without growth if we invest in other sectors that are more around education, care, provisioning, and infrastructure. So that's really interesting, but this is not to deny that at the moment the German trade union movement is in a really difficult position because there have been a lot of jobs lost, 10,000 jobs each month lost at the moment. There have been 40% job decline in automobile industry in Germany, which is super important for the German economy. And that creates tensions and fears. And the danger is to blame the transformation for it. So if you look at the automobile industry, it's not true that this is because of the need to decarbonize. It's as much due to management mistakes in postponing the shift to electrical vehicles for years. There was the scandal around VW and diesel and all the reparation costs that stemmed from it. There was a lack of investment in battery technology. And now we have the geopolitical crisis and wars that affect the energy prices and increase electricity prices. So these are all reasons that don't have to do with we need to address climate change. And in the public debate, there is not often enough a mix-up of what is the real cause and what needs to be the real address for the problem. So the emphasis on clean energy is a huge common denominator within the German labor movement. So the expansion of renewables, and Germany phased out of nuclear, agreed this in 2011, just after Fukushima. And that puts even more pressure on Germany to increase the share of the renewables as soon as possible. Also with the attack of Russia into Ukraine, the cheap gas supply that Germany was relying on for too long puts more pressure on the German economy and on the prices. So it's interesting to see now how the trade unions, with having a very critical mindset, but now being confronted with a situation where the lack of investment by companies and with a change in government in Germany, where the Greens are now not participating in government anymore. We have a government with the Christian Democrats and the Labour Party that is just not continuing the climate action policy that we had. So there were so innovative laws like the so-called heating law, where there was a phase out of gas boilers and the introduction into heat pumps within the next 5 years. And that was celebrated as a huge success for renewables. And they have just taken the law back. And the Conservative Party celebrated it like as now people have their choice. They can continue to have their gas boilers. And it's so unfortunately politically a step backwards. And with the pressure of companies relocating to countries where laws are less environmentally enforcing, yet there is a lot of pressure on trade unions. And it's to be seen if they continue their path of green politics.
But am I right in understanding you that you're saying up until now, the union leaders haven't been a part of that backlash or that blame on electrification?
No. So it's often that they are a public voice that basically tries to tell the truth. But this is not to deny that there is a huge support for the alternative of Germany and a kind of increase in right-wing ideas and populism, and the voters of AfD, they don't believe in climate change. So again, it's a very difficult situation. They play a really important role in putting the scientific facts on the table, in communicating what's really happening. They provide the evidence. They have their own think tank that engages a lot with questions around the socio-ecological transformation. They come up with their own law proposals. So they are pretty much a really active actor in the political field, and that tries to push forward progressive solutions around climate change. And the latest proposal on reintroducing inheritance tax, introducing a tax for mineral companies. And with the tradition of tripartism and a corporatist arrangement in Germany, unions have been often heard. And one example I can give you where a suggestion of trade unions practice is the so-called green furlough scheme. In Germany, there has been a tradition of short-time work, which used to be a crisis response where the Federal Employment Agency would fund some of the wages in terms of low demand due to crisis. And the trade unions have suggested that this kind of reactive instrument, but which helped Germany a lot through the last financial crisis. So there wasn't any unemployment resulting from the financial crisis in 2009. And that was partly due to the short-time work allowances. In England, you would say a furlough scheme, where huge numbers of workers were not dismissed and their wages were paid by the Federal Employment Agency. And the unions have said now, basically, we need a proactive instrument like the furlough scheme, where those companies that are transitioning and that are switching their production towards carbon neutral products, they need to train their workers and you future-proof those jobs. And during this extended phases of training, the Federal Employment Agency is paying the wages of the workers. And that has become law now, and the first companies are using the so-called green furlough scheme. And that is a fantastic example where basically a trade union came up with a policy proposal that has become law. And you could find several of those examples. So the Coal Commission, which was not only a tripartite coalition, but including environmental NGOs, and was almost like a quadrite coalition, where the phase-out model was negotiated and then became the coal law. So that, again, was a kind of corporate model where the influence of the trade unions was really huge, and where the compensation schemes were agreed, the commitments towards renewables in these regions mostly affected by decarbonisation, and where the public investments in these affected regions had been agreed. I mean, that was 40 billion just for the coal regions. It's just so clear that in order to manage the transition, there needs to be much more public funding to achieve the transition and also achieve it in a fair and protected way for workers.
And how does that compare to the UK context? The impression I got from the research of yours that I read was that the kind of continuity that you describe in Germany is perhaps not there in the UK, and there might be more variation both between regions within the UK and over time. In the past 20 years, there was a period under the new Labour government in the noughties when unions both were doing more initiatives of their own and perhaps had more influence over national policy, and that seemed to break down in different ways, both after the financial crisis and then the end of that government in 2010. Is that right? Could you talk a little bit about how that's developed?
At government level, the UK was an early adopter of climate goals with 2008 and the Climate Change Act. And although we know that the UK is not on target, the trade unions, so as you say, the last 15, 20 years, they basically have been almost excluded from policymaking around climate. This has completely eroded trust between the unions and politics, which needed to be rebuilt. So the unions had been excluded from any kind of formal bodies that would deal with climate policies. There were almost no channels for unions anymore to be heard. And that was extreme for climate policy. But it's also a testament to the employment relations in the UK, where the trade unions had been weakened. So when I compare the two countries, if you looked at the demands, some of the demands of the British unions seem to be much more radical than German demands. But up to now, the British unions lacked the institutions to implement any kind of their demands. And interestingly, with the change in government now, this looks like to be changing. So there have been some really promising initiatives, but we had to wait and see now how they work in practice and how it plays out. But the government did announce that clean energy jobs will be important for them. So we have a fair work charter, which was developed by industry and unions, where the companies have to sign up to this charter in order to be eligible for the clean industry bonus. Last month, there was a new body established, the Climate Jobs UK coalition of unions representing workers in the energy sector. And they are campaigning for jobs first, clean energy transition. So they really want to raise the profile that basically climate policies have to combine with proactive employment policy. Then we have the Office for Clean Energy Jobs in DESNES, and the clear expectation that the green transition will create more jobs in the UK. And there will be job losses from phasing out fossil fuels, which are much lower than the job gains that there will be. So it's highly concentrated in regions, and those have been already affected negatively by deindustrialization in the past. So it's a really important goal of unions to say we have to protect those regions. They cannot be victim of further deindustrialization. So there has to be public investments in these regions.
I saw that in one of your reports about the UK, you included some analysis of the carbon capture clusters, which this is the UK's latest approach to trying carbon capture. I wondered whether you'd heard kind of diversity of opinion or seen diversity of opinion from unions, or whether it is broadly supportive of that. And I know that plan is already being rolled back a bit, so that the ambition there is perhaps decreased already. Is that something that unions are fighting, or is there skepticism from unions about that working out anyway?
In general, you see a little bit of a divide in the UK union movement between those who are representing energy workers, who are more in favour of carbon capture, so technological solutions to the energy problem, and unions maybe more in the public sector, which don't have their members in the energy sector. So trade unions are member organizations, so that always plays a role. Unions in the public sector probably feel more free to have more radical criticism to some technological developments. We did also some research directly with workers, not just with unions, but we wanted to see how prepared UK workers for this switch to a green economy. And that was really interesting and gave me really some hope as well, because the amount of workers who are concerned about climate change, who consider that this is really affecting the UK already and that it has to be addressed with extreme or high level of urgency, is a really high number. And they did expect from government to address the problem, and hoping for positive co-benefits. So they assume that dealing with climate change and introducing climate action will improve the natural surroundings. It will improve air and water quality. It will improve soil quality. They also, at the same time, feared that decarbonisation will increase social inequality and increase poverty and will increase the cost of living. So we could see that in terms of political developments and the support of reform, how important it is to combine climate policies with social policies and have more of eco-social policies in place if you want to have the support for net zero and decarbonisation. And that relates to some research that colleagues and I have done around eco-social policies more broadly. We did compare the support of eco-social policies in the UK and other countries like the US, Germany, China, South Africa, and Brazil. We did see that the support is linked to the values that people hold. It's not only the material concerns that people have, but also the higher biospheric values they have, the higher their support is for eco-social policies. And the more they believe in free market, the less likely they are to support eco-social policies, which is really important for policymakers and the public debate to think, how do you frame? So what kind of policies do you have to design? Combine climate policies with social policies to take the fear away that this will decrease your standard of living or your well-being. But then how do you frame these policies so that you basically adhere to the values that people have? So that was a footnote, but the survey also showed us that UK workers would be willing to change jobs and work in the green economy or work in a green job. And a huge number would do this because they think it's interesting and because they would like to contribute to halt climate change. But they were concerned that the jobs wouldn't be as well paid, and who would pay for the costs of retraining, and where would they get the time from? And in this regard, the kind of Fair Work Charter is so important because we know that jobs in wind energy are paid less, that basically support for this energy transition is really also dependent. How do we ensure that these new jobs are decent jobs?
Do unions seem happy with the engagement they're getting with the Labour government in the UK or on these issues? Have people that you've interviewed given the impression that Starmer's government is receptive?
The Trade Union Congress has been instrumental in pushing that agenda forward. I think they have done a great job. Some individual leaders of individual trade unions have been pushing the agenda to be included in climate policies. I think that is a success. That is something that comes across from the research we have done in several countries. So from this big comparative project, that unions seem to be able to push forward their agenda only in the cases where you have progressive governments, like in the UK now, that there's only some change when Labour is in government, no matter how progressive the current Labour government is compared to the Conservatives before. And that's the case in other countries. So the biggest success was the kind of Labour Green government in Germany in the last government. In Spain, unions have been really successful in pushing their agenda, and in Colombia. So whenever you have leftist parties in government, unions are more able to push progressive initiatives forward. And Colombia is an amazing example. Yeah. So President Pedro prioritized climate policy when he came into power, abandoned extractivism and dependence on oil, coal and mining. He saw the just transition as a chance for structural economic transformation. And unions have made proposals in the past, which in coalition with indigenous organizations. And I think that's another important element as well. So often in difficult circumstances, it's the coalition with other societal actors that helped unions to push forward their agenda. So we see then close alliances between unions and government being able to come up with a roadmap. Or in the case of Colombia, there was a lot of engagement through national dialogues that promoted participation, but also very tangible support. So in Colombia, unions have helped workers establish cooperatives. So instead of workers becoming unemployed with help of the unions, they create their own new small businesses in forms then of cooperatives. for ex-coal workers. They offer training themselves for the workers. Or in Spain, you have already job creation through territorial just transition agreements where unions are involved in job creation, and there is already a positive net effect of jobs in those regions where coal was phased out. So if you look at what conditions unions can push forward, then something that comes up from the research is politics matter.
My thanks to Professor Trappmann for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovski for our audio engineering. If you'd like to read the research we discussed, we provided links in the blurb that you can read without a paywall, and do remember to check out our other articles and episodes on landclimate.org. We've got loads of interesting interviews lined up for the next few months, so please do subscribe to us on your preferred platform, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.